Jacob Fitzgerald is a wealthy, middle-aged businessman who seems to have everything, except for peace and purpose. Despite his wealth, he feels a hollow emptiness, deepened by watching his once lively mother, Irene, decline into the fog of Alzheimer's. Living alone in a grand but empty mansion, Jacob's life feels increasingly meaningless. One fateful evening, as he takes a solitary walk in the woods near his home, he encounters a lost young girl named Mara. Little does he know, this chance meeting will lead him on a journey that reawakens his heart, gives him a new sense of family, and helps him reconnect with his own past and with his mother's legacy. The crisp autumn air settled around Jacob Fitzgerald as he wandered along the narrow, winding path through the forest bordering his estate. With every step, leaves crunched beneath his polished shoes, a symphony of reds, oranges, and browns swirling around him as though nature itself were pulling him deeper into the heart of the woods. It had been years since he'd last ventured this far into the forest, but tonight, restless and unsettled, he felt an inexplicable need to escape the walls of his mansion. There was something about the emptiness of his grand home, with its cold marble floors and echoing halls, that seemed to amplify the hollowness within him. He had everything he could possibly want: wealth, prestige, the freedom to do whatever he pleased. Yet he was haunted by a relentless feeling of isolation, a void that even his closest friends could not fill. Tonight, the familiar grounding sounds of nature soothed him in a way that nothing else could. Birds rustled in the branches above, and a distant owl hooted softly as the daylight faded. He drew in a deep breath, inhaling the earthy scent of damp leaves and moss, savoring the way the simple purity of the forest wrapped around him. He would have continued down the path lost in his own thoughts if it weren't for the faint sound of muffled sobs filtering through the quiet. He paused, furrowing his brow, straining to listen. The cries were faint, barely audible over the gentle rustling of the trees, but unmistakably human. A pang of unease settled in his chest, a rare sensation for a man who was usually so detached, so composed. He scanned his surroundings, his eyes narrowing as he traced the sound to a nearby cluster of trees and brush. Cautiously, Jacob made his way toward the source of the sound, treading softly so as not to startle whoever might be there. As he approached, he caught a glimpse of a small figure huddled beneath the overhanging branches of an oak tree. The child, no more than 10 or 11, sat curled up, her knees drawn tightly to her chest, her face hidden behind her arms. She wore a threadbare sweater and jeans that were too short, revealing ankles that were pale and smudged with dirt. Her hair, a tangled mess, hung over her face, hiding her expression, but her body trembled with each quiet sob. Jacob felt a strange tightening in his chest. 1,000 questions surged in his mind. Who was she? What was she doing here alone, shivering and vulnerable in the middle of the woods at dusk? Taking a careful step forward, he cleared his throat softly. "Hello there," he said, his voice gentle but firm. The girl flinched, her sobs cutting off abruptly. She looked up at him, her wide, frightened eyes locking onto his. For a moment, she seemed as though she might bolt, like a deer caught in the gaze of a predator. Jacob quickly held up his hands in a placating gesture. "It's all right," he said softly. "I didn't mean to scare you." She looked at him warily, her gaze darting to the path behind him, as though calculating her chances of escape. Jacob softened his expression, crouching down to her level, his voice even gentler now. "Are you lost?" he asked. The girl hesitated, her eyes studying him with a mixture of suspicion and desperation. After a moment, she nodded, her voice barely a whisper. I don't have anywhere to go." Her words hit him harder than he expected, stirring an emotion he couldn't quite name. His mind raced as he took in her appearance, the dirt on her cheeks, the thinness of her frame, the shadows under her eyes. It was clear she had been living rough for some time. He wondered how long she had been out here, surviving on her own, with no one to look out for her. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Mara," she replied, her voice so soft it was almost swallowed by the forest sounds around them. Her eyes dropped to the ground, as if embarrassed to admit it, as if her name might somehow expose a weakness she was trying to hide. "Well, Mara," Jacob said, offering her a small, reassuring smile, "it's getting late, and it's far too cold for you to be out here alone. How about you come back to my home, just for tonight? You can have a warm meal, a bath, and a safe place to sleep." She looked at him skeptically, her body tense as though she were bracing for something worse. He could see the wariness in her eyes, the way she had learned to distrust kindness, probably from a life spent on the streets or in places where kindness came with strings attached. "I promise, you'll be safe," he added, sensing her reluctance. "Just for one night. And if you want to leave in the morning, you're free to go." After what felt like an eternity, she nodded, her gaze still cautious but her posture softening just a little. Jacob felt a strange relief at her acceptance, an eagerness he couldn't quite explain. Together, they began the short walk back to his estate, Jacob keeping a slow pace to match her smaller strides. As they emerged from the woods, the sight of his mansion loomed above them, glowing softly against the twilight sky. Mara's eyes widened, her expression a mixture of awe and apprehension. Jacob understood. His home was imposing even to those familiar with it, and to a child who had never known luxury, it must have seemed like a castle out of a storybook. When they entered the grand foyer, Jacob could feel Mara's hesitance as she glanced around at the polished floors, the sweeping staircase, the grand chandelier that hung like a glittering waterfall of crystal overhead. She looked so small and fragile against the backdrop of opulence, like a tiny sparrow that had flown accidentally into a gilded cage. The housekeeper, Rose, appeared in the hallway, her eyebrows shooting up in surprise when she saw Jacob with a young girl by his side. She had known Jacob for decades, had watched him grow from a bright-eyed boy into the distant man he was now, and in all that time, she'd never seen him bring anyone back to his home, let alone a young, disheveled girl. "Mr. Fitzgerald?" she asked, casting a questioning glance at Mara. "This is Mara," he said with a nod, his tone calm and steady. "She'll be staying here for the night." Rose didn't question him further, though her expression was a mixture of confusion and curiosity. She simply nodded, her years of professionalism guiding her, and disappeared down the hallway to prepare a room. Jacob led Mara into a cozy sitting room, where a fire crackled warmly in the hearth. The room was decorated with rich mahogany furniture, deep red velvet curtains, and shelves lined with old leather-bound books. Mara hesitated, standing awkwardly by the door until Jacob gently motioned for her to sit. "Are you hungry?" he asked, watching as she perched on the edge of an armchair, her eyes never resting on one place for long, as if she couldn't believe all that she was seeing. Mara nodded, and Jacob called for Rose to bring in a tray of food. Soon, a plate of roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, and steamed vegetables was placed in front of her. She stared at it, wide-eyed, as though she hadn't seen a meal like this in a long time. Tentatively, she picked up her fork, her movements cautious as if she expected someone to snatch it away at any moment. "Take your time," Jacob said, his voice soft as he sat across from her. He could see the flicker of relief in her eyes as she took her first bite, her guard dropping just a fraction with each mouthful. As she ate, he realized he hadn't felt this invested in someone else's well-being in years. Perhaps since his mother had first fallen ill, he mused. Later, when Mara had finished her meal, Rose guided her to a guest room down the hall. Jacob lingered outside her door, feeling an odd sense of protectiveness. As he listened to Rose show Mara where everything was, he caught a glimpse of her face, softened in the warm glow of the bedside lamp. There was something vulnerable, something resilient in the way she looked at her surroundings. It was clear she'd been through more hardship than any child should. When Rose finished tucking her in, Jacob stepped into the room and gave Mara a gentle smile. "Good night, Mara," he said softly. "If you need anything, just call out." She nodded, her eyes already beginning to droop with exhaustion. As he left her room and closed the door behind him, Jacob felt a flicker of warmth that he hadn't known in a long time, a feeling of purpose, of connection, something beyond himself. Back in his own room, Jacob lay awake long into the night, his thoughts lingering on Mara. He found himself wondering who she was, where she had come from, and what twists of fate had brought her to him on this quiet autumn evening. In the darkness of his room, he stared at the ceiling, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth as he realized that, for the first time in years, he was looking forward to the morning. The next morning, Jacob woke earlier than usual, feeling an unusual sense of anticipation tugging him from sleep. He lay still for a moment, processing the events of the previous night. The image of Mara, shivering and alone in the woods, drifted back to him, sharp and vivid in his mind. She had looked so fragile, so painfully young and worn down by circumstances he could only guess at. Yet beneath her fear, there had been a quiet strength in her eyes, a determination that lingered in his thoughts. He hadn't expected a mere child to affect him this way, to stir something in him that he had long considered dormant. Dressing quickly, he made his way downstairs. He found Rose bustling about the kitchen, preparing breakfast, her expression a mixture of curiosity and cautious concern. She glanced up when he entered, a question already forming in her eyes, but she held her tongue. "Is she awake?" he asked, glancing toward the hallway that led to the guest room. "Not yet," Rose replied. "I checked on her a few minutes ago and she was still sleeping soundly." Jacob nodded, feeling an odd sense of relief. She deserved the chance to rest after what must have been an exhausting journey, wherever it had taken her before she arrived in his woods. As he poured himself a cup of coffee, he felt the house begin to stir in a way it hadn't in a long time. There was a new energy in the air, a tension mixed with curiosity and a faint hint of hope. Rose set about preparing an extra-large breakfast, a spread of scrambled eggs, bacon, freshly baked rolls, fruit, and oatmeal with honey. "I figured the child might be hungry," she said with a faint smile. Her tone softened from her usual brisk efficiency. Jacob realized she was just as affected as he was by Mara's arrival, even if neither of them quite knew what to make of it. As they worked quietly, a soft sound from the hallway caught their attention. Mara stood at the doorway, looking hesitant and a little overwhelmed. She wore the same clothes as the night before, and her hair was a tangled mess around her face. Her gaze flicked from Jacob to Rose, wide and uncertain, as if she couldn't believe that all of this home, this breakfast, this attention, was meant for her. "Good morning, Mara," Jacob greeted, his tone warm and encouraging. "Did you sleep well?" She nodded, though her eyes remained wary, as if waiting for some unseen trick to reveal itself. Jacob beckoned her toward the table, gesturing to the food spread out before them. She moved cautiously, each step tentative, her gaze darting around the room as if she were mapping every detail. "Please, sit and eat," he said, pulling out a chair for her. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face for any hint of insincerity before she finally took the seat. Rose placed a plate in front of her, heaping it with eggs and bacon. Mara stared at it, her hands hovering uncertainly over her utensils. Jacob watched as she glanced up at him, her expression a mixture of suspicion and something that looked painfully close to gratitude. "Go on," he urged gently. "There's plenty for everyone." At his words, Mara finally picked up her fork and took a small, cautious bite. Her face softened slightly as she tasted the warm, savory food, and she quickly took another bite, and then another, as if she feared the plate might be taken from her at any moment. Jacob could tell she was trying to pace herself, but her hunger was obvious. He felt a pang of sadness watching her. It was clear she hadn't had a meal like this in a very long time. As she ate, he decided to try and learn more about her. He didn't want to press too hard, but he needed to understand at least some part of her story if he was going to help her. "Mara," he began carefully, "do you remember how you ended up in the woods last night?" She paused, her fork midway to her mouth, and looked up at him with a guarded expression. For a moment he thought she wouldn't answer, But then she took a deep breath, setting her fork down, her hands clasping tightly in her lap. I didn't have anywhere else to go," she said softly, her voice barely audible. I was staying with some people in the city, but they didn't want me around anymore." Jacob felt a tightening in his chest at her words. It was as he had feared. She had been abandoned, left to fend for herself with no one to care for her or even look after her safety. "How long were you alone?" he asked gently, keeping his tone as calm as possible so as not to alarm her. "A while," she murmured, her eyes downcast, avoiding his gaze. "I was trying to find somewhere safe to sleep each night. Sometimes people were nice, but other times—" Her voice trailed off and a shadow passed over her face. Jacob didn't press her for more. He could imagine the sorts of dangers she had likely encountered, the hardships she had faced trying to survive on her own. The thought of her navigating those dangers alone, a child with no one to protect her, filled him with a deep sense of sorrow and a fierce desire to protect her from ever having to go through it again. "Well," he said, his voice firm but gentle, "you don't have to worry about that anymore. As long as you're here, you'll be safe. You'll have a warm bed, food, and anything else you need. I'll make sure of it." She looked up at him, surprise flashing in her eyes as though she hadn't expected such an offer. Jacob could see the faintest glimmer of hope there, though it was tempered with caution. He knew she had likely heard empty promises before, words of kindness that were later taken back, but he wanted her to understand that he was different, that he meant every word he said. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice so soft he almost didn't hear it. Jacob nodded, giving her a reassuring smile, and Rose watched the exchange with an approving nod. It was clear she, too, was beginning to warm to the idea of Mara staying. After breakfast, Jacob decided to show Mara around the estate, hoping to help her feel more comfortable in this unfamiliar setting. They walked through the grand halls and the vast, echoing rooms filled with antique furniture and rich tapestries. Mara's eyes grew wide as she took in the luxurious surroundings, though she kept a cautious distance from anything that looked too delicate, as though afraid she might break something simply by being near it. When they reached the library, a grand room with towering shelves of books reaching almost to the ceiling, Mara paused, staring at the rows upon rows of leather-bound volumes with something akin to awe. She moved toward a shelf, her hand hesitating just above the spines of the books, as though afraid to touch them. "Do you like to read?" Jacob asked, watching her expression. She nodded, her eyes still fixed on the books. "I used to, when I was in school, but I haven't had any books in a long time." "Well, you're welcome to read any of these," he said, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "This library is as much yours as it is mine now." Her gaze flicked to him, a spark of excitement breaking through her usual guarded expression. For the first time since she'd arrived, he saw a glimpse of the child she might have been if life had been kinder to her, a girl with hopes, dreams, and a love for the simple joys of reading. She reached out tentatively, her fingers brushing the spine of a book, and he could see her hands trembling slightly. "Thank you," she murmured again, her voice filled with genuine gratitude. He realized then just how rare kindness must have been in her life, how starved she was for simple acts of generosity. The realization filled him with a quiet determination. He wanted to give her more than just food and shelter. He wanted to show her that she was valued, that she deserved to be treated with care and respect. As the days passed, Mara began to settle into life at the estate. She was still cautious, still wary of getting too comfortable, but bit by bit, Jacob saw her walls beginning to come down. She grew closer to Rose, who treated her with a gentle motherly kindness, teaching her small things like how to bake bread or tend to the garden. Mara would follow Rose around the house, absorbing everything she could, her natural curiosity shining through. Jacob noticed how she gravitated toward the library in her free time, spending hours curled up in one of the armchairs, devouring book after book. She had a sharp mind, a hunger for knowledge that reminded him of himself at her age, and he encouraged her to read as much as she wanted. He found himself joining her in the library some evenings, reading quietly in companionable silence, the two of them lost in their own worlds, yet sharing a quiet connection. But despite the warmth growing between them, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that Mara was still hiding something, a weight that lay heavy on her shoulders. There were moments when she would go quiet, her gaze distant, lost in some memory she couldn't escape. He knew there were parts of her story she hadn't yet shared, pieces of her past that haunted her still. One evening, as they sat in the library, Mara looked up from her book, her expression troubled. She hesitated, as if debating whether to speak before finally asking, "Why are you being so kind to me?" Jacob looked at her, surprised by the question. He paused, considering his words carefully. "Because I want to," he said simply. "Because I believe everyone deserves kindness, especially those who've had a hard time in life." She looked down, fidgeting with the edge of her sleeve, her brow furrowed. "But what if I don't deserve it?" The quiet pain in her voice cut through him. He wanted to reach out, to reassure her, but he held himself back, not wanting to overwhelm her. Instead, he met her gaze, his expression gentle but firm. "You deserve kindness, Mara," he said softly. "No one deserves to suffer, and whatever you've been through, it doesn't change who you are. It doesn't make you any less deserving of care, or comfort, or happiness." She didn't respond, but he saw the faintest hint of a tear glisten in her eye before she quickly looked away. He knew she was still struggling to accept his words, still battling the demons that whispered otherwise. But he was willing to be patient, to let her find her way toward healing in her own time. As the weeks went by, Jacob could feel Mara's presence becoming an inseparable part of his home. She had adapted to the rhythm of the house with a natural ease that surprised him, slipping into her place among them as though she had always been there. The once silent halls now held the soft murmur of her voice as she asked Rose questions about baking, the quiet echo of her footsteps as she wandered the library's aisles, or the occasional burst of laughter that escaped her as she grew more comfortable. In the evenings, Jacob would often find her by the large window in the sitting room, gazing out at the expanse of woods with a contemplative look, as though she were both at peace and still restless, still waiting for something unnamed. One day, while they were out in the garden, Jacob finally dared to bring up the question that had lingered at the back of his mind since she arrived: her family. He had sensed her reticence, her avoidance of any discussion that might bring up her past, but he also knew that healing required facing those wounds, acknowledging the memories that haunted her. "Mara," he began gently, "do you have anyone out there? Family, friends, someone who might be looking for you?" She froze, her gaze dropping to the ground as her fingers fidgeted with a stray thread on her sleeve. He could see the tension in her posture, the way her shoulders stiffened as though bracing for a blow. Jacob immediately regretted his question, but before he could apologize, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "My mother." She paused, her voice catching. "She left a long time ago. I don't remember her very well. And my father, he—" She took a deep breath, a shadow crossing her face. "He was difficult." Jacob's heart ached at the sorrow woven into her words. He could read between the lines, could imagine the pain she had endured at such a young age. He knew that the word difficult probably barely scratched the surface of whatever had happened between her and her father, and the thought filled him with a fierce protectiveness. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I didn't mean to bring up painful memories." She shook her head, her gaze still fixed on the ground. "It's okay. I didn't have anyone. Not really. I thought maybe I'd be better off on my own." Jacob's heart broke at her words, the quiet resignation in her voice. No child should have to face the world alone, to bear the weight of survival without anyone to care for them, to love them. He wanted to tell her that she was wrong, that she wasn't alone anymore, that she had him, and Rose, and this home. But he held back, sensing that she needed to come to that realization on her own. Instead, he placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, grounding her in the present, in the here and now. "You don't have to go through life alone anymore, Mara," he said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "You're part of this family now. Rose and I, we're here for you, and we'll always be here for you." She looked up at him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. For a moment, she seemed too overwhelmed to speak, and then, almost impulsively, she reached out and hugged him. Jacob was momentarily taken aback, but he wrapped his arms around her, holding her close, hoping that she could feel the sincerity of his words, that she could feel just how much she mattered to him. They stood there in silence, the weight of her past and the promise of a new beginning mingling in the quiet embrace. When she finally pulled away, there was a newfound determination in her eyes, a spark of hope that he hadn't seen before. In the following days, Mara seemed lighter, more at ease, as though a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She continued to immerse herself in the small routines of the house, helping Rose with chores, tending to the garden, and in quieter moments curling up with a book in the library. Jacob often found himself smiling as he watched her, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction in seeing her grow more comfortable, more at home. One evening, as they sat in the library together, Mara closed her book and looked over at him, her expression thoughtful. "Jacob," she said hesitantly, do you believe people can change? That they can be better?" Jacob set his book aside, meeting her gaze. He knew this question was about more than just a passing curiosity. It was a reflection of her own inner struggle, her desire to reconcile with her past, to believe that she wasn't defined by it. "I do," he replied, his voice steady. "I believe that everyone has the capacity for change, for growth. It's not always easy, and sometimes it takes time, but with the right support, with people who care about you, it's possible." She nodded slowly, digesting his words. "I want to be better," she whispered, her voice filled with a vulnerability that touched him deeply. "I want to be someone worth caring about." "You already are, Mara," he said gently. "You're worth so much more than you realize." The conversation marked a turning point for her. In the weeks that followed, Jacob could see her taking small steps toward healing, embracing the warmth and security that his home offered. She began to smile more freely, to laugh without hesitation, to allow herself moments of joy without the shadow of her past clouding her every thought. It was as though she were rediscovering herself, finding pieces of herself that she had lost along the way. But as winter drew closer, Jacob knew there was one last thing he needed to do for Mara. Despite her growing sense of belonging, he sensed that a part of her was still holding back, still haunted by the remnants of her past. He knew that, for her to truly move forward, she needed to confront those ghosts, to say goodbye to the life she had left behind. One crisp morning, he asked Mara to join him on a walk through the woods. They strolled in comfortable silence, the air filled with the faint scent of pine and the crunch of leaves beneath their feet. Eventually, they came to a small clearing, a place where the trees opened up to reveal a wide expanse of sky. Jacob paused, turning to face her. "I think it's time for you to decide," he said gently. "You can stay here, build a new life, and let this place become your true home. Or, if there's something you need to do, some part of your past you need to face, then know that I'll support you no matter what." She looked at him, her expression conflicted, torn between the security she had found in his home and the lingering pull of her past. I don't want to go back to that life," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "But there's something I feel I need to do. Maybe I need to say goodbye, in my own way." Jacob nodded, understanding. He hadn't expected her to make such a decision lightly, and he was proud of her for choosing to confront her past rather than running from it. "I'll be here when you're ready," he assured her. "This home will always be waiting for you." A few days later, Mara set off to the city, with Jacob's blessing and support. It was a bittersweet parting, filled with quiet words of encouragement and promises to return. Jacob watched her go, feeling a mix of pride and anxiety, hoping that she would find the closure she sought and come back with a renewed sense of peace. The days stretched into weeks, and Jacob found himself missing Mara's presence in the house. Rose often glanced at the empty seat at the dinner table, her gaze soft with a wistful sadness. The house felt quieter, emptier, as though a vital piece were missing. But Jacob held on to his faith in Mara, trusting that she would find her way back. Finally, on a cold winter evening, just as the first snow began to fall, there was a knock at the door. Jacob hurried to answer it, his heart pounding with anticipation, and when he opened the door, he found Mara standing there, her cheeks flushed from the cold, her eyes shining with a quiet strength he had never seen before. Without a word, she stepped inside, and Jacob wrapped her in a warm embrace. She looked up at him, a small smile on her lips, and he could see that something fundamental had shifted within her. She was still the same girl who had arrived on his doorstep that stormy night, but there was a newfound resilience in her, a sense of peace that radiated from her. "Welcome home," he whispered, his voice filled with emotion. As they sat by the fire that night, Mara shared bits and pieces of her journey, of the places she had visited, the people she had met. She had revisited the parts of her life that once held pain, and in doing so, she had reclaimed those memories, letting go of the bitterness and embracing the lessons they had taught her. In the end, Jacob realized that Mara had found what she had been searching for, not in the city or in her past, but within herself. She had come back whole, ready to embrace a new life filled with love, stability, and hope. From that day on, Mara truly became part of their family. The house was no longer a place of shelter, it was her home. Jacob, Rose, and Mara found joy in the simple routines of their days, creating memories that filled the once lonely halls with laughter and warmth. Years passed, and the estate transformed from a solitary refuge into a place of love and community. The once forgotten house in the woods became a cherished home, a place where healing and hope had taken root, a testament to the power of kindness and second chances. And as Mara stood by the window, watching the snow blanket the trees, she felt a sense of belonging that she had never known before, grateful for the journey that had led her here.